in evolutionary biology and studying birds. I've been interested in birds since I was 6 years old. Since I was 6 years old, my older brother began feeding birds in my parents' backyard, and he kind of took me on this journey with him of learning to identify the birds that pass through my parents' yard where I grew up in Athens, Georgia. So today we're going to talk about hummingbirds, and I think this is a really appropriate time to talk about these creatures because they're starting to migrate through New Mexico right now. And I think we can all agree that birds are fascinating as a group of organisms, but maybe hummingbirds are some of the most fascinating birds, which makes them really unique. Can everyone see this okay? Cool. So I'll give you a general outline for where I want to go in this presentation. I want to first kind of give you a global perspective of hummingbirds and look at hummingbird species across the world. And then I want to look at hummingbird evolution, so how these species with really unique traits came about and evolved from some common ancestor. And then what they teach us about bird ecology, so how birds interact with one another in their environment and how they have evolved these really specialized traits. Also want to talk about hummingbirds of North America, so slowly zooming into New Mexico or local hummingbird species. And then what hummingbirds teach us about bird migration, which is a really fascinating phenomenon in and of itself that we could talk about. We could spend several classes or presentations talking about that alone. Then talk about common hummingbirds of New Mexico, and then what hummingbirds teach us about bird physiology, so adaptations for flight and for efficient respiration and things like this, that hummingbirds are kind of the extreme in many ways. They're the extreme in bird physiology, they're the extreme in bird evolution, and so all these things that we think of as birds being very unique for are really find their extreme or most impressive limit in hummingbirds. I want to talk about hummingbirds and climate change. So what's happening to hummingbird populations, to distributions and occurrence of hummingbirds as the climate warms. And then finally, I want to get very practical and talk about how to attract hummingbirds to your backyard and some tips for doing that. So let's first talk generally about hummingbirds of the world. So hummingbirds, if you had to pick a family of birds, I imagine that hummingbirds are most closely related to, I imagine you wouldn't guess swifts. Or some of you might be familiar with white-throated swifts, or if you're from a little farther east, chimney swifts. So these birds that look like flying cigars with wings. They have these really thin cylindrical bodies and these long narrow wings, and they're very maneuverable. They spend almost all of their time in the air. And actually these are the most closely related family of birds to the hummingbirds. So they're in the same order, which is one of the classifications that scientists use for species. And then if you actually look, like, there's very few similarities, but one similarity you would notice if you look closely at the feet of swifts. So swifts only perch vertically on the sides of cliffs and chimneys and structures like that. And they have these really dainty feet. They can't walk, they can't perch upright. And if you look at hummingbirds, they're actually very, very similar. Hummingbirds also can't walk. They have very dainty feet. So this is one trait that's actually very similar in both of these groups of species, but otherwise they look very, very different. Hummingbirds are a strictly New World species. So I kind of deceived you a minute ago when I talked about global hummingbirds. They are only in North and South America, and there are roughly about 350 species in both of those continents. And then hummingbirds split from the swifts like 42 million years ago, which is a really long time even in thinking about evolutionary time. And since then, the common ancestor, all of the hummingbirds that we know today, all 350 species, made its way to South America. And of course, this was when the continents were much closer together, so it wasn't crossing the entire ocean. But although that happened, we have some examples of very hummingbird-like fossils in places of like present-day France, for example. So we have evidence that very similar creatures did live in the Old World at one point. So it migrated to South America, and then it began to diversify into all of the different species we now know. And there's evidence that hummingbird diversity, the rate at which populations are diverging from one another, is actually exceeding the rate at which populations of hummingbirds are going extinct. And of course, we're talking about very large timescales here, but in a few million years, barring any massive changes to the planet, which seems unlikely at this point, but there probably be more hummingbird species than there now are today. So this is a rough, what scientists or taxonomists call a phylogenetic tree, which is basically a tree of life for organisms. And in this case, 3 different groups of birds: the hummingbirds, the swifts, and the nightjars. So maybe you're familiar with nighthawks or common poor wills or species like that. Can people hear me in the back as well? I need to talk louder. Okay, cool. So you can see each node on the branch is where populations or groups of species diverged at some point, and then those diversified into several different species. And so all the way back here at some really high level or really far back in evolutionary time, hummingbirds are related to nighthawks. And they're most closely related, as I mentioned a minute ago, to the swifts, which you see over here on this branch of the tree. And then this is the most recent common ancestor, Pan Trochilidae, which is the most recent common ancestor of all present-day hummingbirds, and that's the organism that made its way to South America. So that gives you kind of a background on hummingbird evolution. And then the natural question is, well, how did that one species diversify into the 350 different species we now see? And this is through something called adaptive radiation, where well, we'll tackle it one word at a time. So adaptive radiation, adaptive means that the organism is changing in response to its environment in some way. A radiation means that like some spreading outward from some point maybe. And so adaptive radiation, when you put those together, it basically means that you take one organism and as it spreads across the landscape, and this could have happened in South America when there were few other organisms. And so this organism comes in, there's all sorts of ecological space or all sorts of space on the landscape to exploit. And all the individuals of that organism are competing with one another. And so they begin to partition themselves according to different niches, as ecologists would refer to them as, on the landscape. And so the end result is that you have one population that diverges into multiple populations, because each of those populations is beginning to use the environment in a slightly different way, to acquire resources in a different way, and it develops morphological or differences in size and shape according with that. And so over time you get a huge diversity of different forms, colors, bill sizes, shapes, flight styles, and things like this. And so now we have this tremendous diversity, which is highest in the Andes Mountains. So if you go to like the Peruvian Andes, for example, you can see as many as like 60 hummingbird species in the same general part of the Andes Mountains, which is over more than 10 times the amount you can see simultaneously here in New Mexico. And this is true of many different bird species. A lot of families have their highest diversity in the tropics, and that's largely because the tropics have been favorable for life for the longest period of time. The temperate regions have undergone glaciation and ice ages that have pushed species around and caused some species to go extinct. But the tropics are old, they have rich soils, they have tremendously high plant diversity. And it was actually the rising of the Andes Mountains between about 10 and 20 million years ago that also led to further diversification of hummingbirds, because at one point you would have populations whose ranges would have spread across what would become the peak of the Andes. And so as the Andes rise, as the peak becomes alpine or climatic conditions become unfavorable for life, you end up with one population being split into two, one on the Pacific slope of the Andes and one on the eastern slope. And so you get a lot of diversification through that. So this is a map of roughly of hummingbird diversity across the two continents. So we have the lowest here, we have, I heard somebody mention Southeast Arizona earlier, so there's fairly high hummingbird diversity in Southeast Arizona. A lot of Mexican species, the northern extent of their range sort of peaks into the mountains there, the Chiricahua Mountains, for example. And so, but that's nothing compared to the really high diversities. Darker red colors go up to 80 different species in one area in the Andes Mountains. And this, again, so tropics were where they originated, so they would have diversified there, and then some species would have evolved to be able to migrate to more temperate regions for the summer, and then return in the winter. And so, again, broad elevational range, which can lead to divergence of populations across those elevations. And hummingbirds go up to 16,000 feet in the Andes, and they have incredible adaptations to be able to live at that elevation, which we'll talk about.
Year-round?
Year-round. In some cases. Some migrate up and down with just altitudinally, but some do spend the entire year there. And then the tropics, again, they have high plant diversity, so some parts of the tropics have like 300 plant species per hectare, which is many, many times more than we have here, and that supports a lot of insects, and also there's a lot of flowering plants, which supports hummingbirds as their nectar eaters, but hummingbirds also eat insects, so that high diversity of insects supports a high diversity of hummingbirds as well. And there's less seasonal variation in temperature, so if you're a hummingbird, you have a really high metabolism, and you need a lot of energy to stay warm, then it's ideal to be in a place that is more warm throughout the year and has less seasonal swings in temperature. So I want to talk briefly about hummingbird size extremes. So we have two kind of ends of the spectrum for hummingbird size. We have the bee hummingbird on the left, which is a bird of the Caribbean, and they're about that big. So they're like 2/3 the size of a rufous hummingbird, which is the smallest, well, calliope hummingbird, sorry, which is the smallest we have in North America. And then we have all the way up to giant hummingbirds, which live in the Andes Mountains, and they get up to 6 inches long. So they're more like titmouse size, or maybe like Buick's wren, or a little bit larger. And we have a special connection to them here in Albuquerque because some researchers at the University of New Mexico, so my advisor and a former PhD student of his, did work on giant hummingbirds in the Andes. And his PhD student, Jesse Williamson, was interested in looking at migration of giant hummingbirds. So giant hummingbirds spend the summer in the Peruvian Andes at high elevation, and then many of them were disappearing for the winter, and nobody knew where they were going. So she went out and she tagged these hummingbirds in the Andes, and she put these geolocators on them, which are little tags, little backpacks. And these backpacks record the amount of light per day, so they record photoperiod, and they record pressure too, so you know how high in altitude or elevation. I think it's around 6,000 miles round trip. And then she discovered that not all the hummingbirds were doing that. Some of them were actually staying in Peru, but they were migrating to lower altitude for the winter. And so she found that these populations had divergent migratory behaviors, which led her to question, are they isolated reproductively from one another? So are they different populations genetically? And so she took genetic samples, and she found that these two populations had been divergent for 3 million years. So they looked identical, so it's an example of what we call cryptic speciation, where species can look identical by sight but be very genetically different, because all of those genetic differences are associated with things other than plumage color or size or shape or anything that we would notice visually. And so she discovered there's actually 2 species of giant hummingbirds, which is an amazing discovery, and she's still working on this system. But this leads us into trying to understand how so many different species,
How would you catch a hummingbird and put it back there?
So have you ever seen like a bird banding demonstration? So typically what bird banders do, and this works for hummingbirds as well, is you put out what are called mist nets. So mist nets are these really fine mesh nets. They're kind of like netting you would put around your garden, but they're much lighter. And so birds will, if you put them in an area where you know there are a lot of giant hummingbirds or there are giant hummingbird feeders, eventually a giant hummingbird will fly into the net, and then it just drops into this pocket of the net, which is this kind of mesh, very silky mesh pocket. And then you go extract that bird and you process it, so you can band it, you can put a backpack on it, you can take a feather sample for a genetic analysis or anything like that. So it's a really harmless method to capture birds. So there are these size extremes and there's everything in between, right? Maybe not as many large hummingbirds that approach the size of giant hummingbirds, but there's certainly a lot of small ones. And it leads us to ask, like, how could so many different species of hummingbird that seem to acquire resources in a very similar way, they're all nectar eaters or drinkers, they all acquire food in the same way, they all nest in similar areas, so how are they coexisting on the landscape? And so from an ecological perspective, this might seem impossible, right? Because you have so many different species competing. But actually, they are partitioning the landscape up in a manner that I was describing earlier with adaptive radiation, where species learn to use resources in different ways and acquire them in different ways and therefore avoid competing with one another. It's very similar for hummingbirds, especially in tropical regions where there are several species in one acre, for example. And the way that they do this is basically in like a typical tropical environment where you have several hummingbird species. The community in one kind of on like a micro scale might look something like this. You have 1 to 2 larger territorial species that are dominant. They can sort of outmuscle the other hummingbirds. They scare them away from their flowers. So they establish a territory or a monopoly, much like you might have seen hummingbirds do at your own feeders in your backyard. And these 1 to 2 larger species will dominate these large flowers. So they have plenty of food for themselves, plenty of food to raise young, and they scare all the other smaller species away. And then you have one long-billed species, so a species that may not necessarily be that large, but it has a really long beak, and that goes to scattered flowers that are more scattered across the landscape, but that have more nectar. Each flower is a little larger, has more nectar, and with the long beak they can reach inside and drink that nectar. Then you have one short-billed species, which actually occupies areas where flowers are more abundant, but there's less nectar per flower. So the flowers are smaller, you don't need as long a beak. And so in that way, so far you've got several species that have divided the landscape up differently and avoid competing with one another, spending all that energy to compete that could be used to breed or forage or something like that. And then you finally typically have a sharp-billed filcher, which is like a thief hummingbird that goes in and pierces the base of flowers and drinks the nectar from those flowers. So it's kind of darting in and out of maybe other hummingbirds' territories and drinking nectar that way. So it's more of an opportunist. Before I go any further, I wanted to tell you briefly about sunbirds, which are the hummingbirds of the old world. And this is just an example of what we call a convergent evolution. So where species that are, or groups of species that are totally unrelated will often develop or evolve the same or similar traits. These are sunbirds. They don't hover like hummingbirds do. They're not nearly as hyperactive, but they've evolved these long, sharp beaks to be able to acquire nectar in the same way that hummingbirds do. So these are some photos I took in South Africa. And this is the collared sunbird and the white-breasted sunbird. And you'll see them flitting across the landscape and foraging like a hummingbird would, except without some of the other physiological adaptations like hovering, flight, and that sort of thing. So this is roughly a map by state of hummingbird diversity in North America and Mexico. This is where I'm from. I think we got gypped here. There's only about one species. It says 3 to 5, but really there's one species there regularly that breeds there. That's the ruby-throated hummingbird, the kind of eastern counterpart of the black-chinned hummingbird. And then as you go farther west, so these maps are actually total number of species that have been recorded in the state, so not necessarily regular visitors. So it says New Mexico has 11. We've had several rare hummingbird species show up, but in reality we have, I think, 4 species that are here regularly, 2 that breed, and 2 that are here on migration. And that would be, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then you can see it changes very rapidly. You get into Mexico and all of a sudden there's 56 different hummingbird species in Mexico. So these birds would have evolved in the tropics, and then a few species would have evolved to migrate all the way to North America and back again. So that leads us to a discussion of hummingbird migration, which is similar to bird migration in many ways. There will be some differences we'll discuss. But there's long been sort of two main theories of why birds migrate. So you can imagine that migration is a really expensive undertaking. So you have to travel thousands of miles in many cases. You have to fly thousands of miles and expend all of this energy. In some cases, risk crossing like the Gulf of Mexico, or mortality rate is fairly high. And we know that for such a trait to evolve, that it has to be advantageous. So the birds that are doing that trait have to be outdoing or reproducing more offspring than the ones that aren't of that population. And so it's a big question, like how would this ever come about? How would this ever be advantageous? And there's been two theories to explain that. One is that birds are exploiting resources as the geographic location of max resource abundance changes. So I mean that, like, if you're in the tropics and here in New Mexico, like right now, we're having this huge explosion of resources where there's lots of flowers and nectar and lots of insects on the landscape. And so if you're a tropical species, you might want to travel to try and take advantage of that huge abundance of resources. So that was the kind of reigning theory for a long time, that birds are basically trying to follow the resources across the landscape. And so that leads them to temperate regions in the summer and back to tropical regions in the winter when there's fewer resources in temperate areas. But the more recent and I think more widely held now theory is that they're basically escaping harsh climates. So migration would have originally evolved to escape competition in the tropics. So if you can imagine, like, again, so many different hummingbird species in one area, at some point it might become advantageous for one of those species to travel elsewhere to exploit an area where there aren't hummingbirds, where all the nectar, for the most part, it can have to itself. And so this is indeed the, I think, established theory right now of bird migration, that birds are basically leaving areas of high competition, and then once they find themselves here in New Mexico, for example, and it gets really cold in the winter, they're escaping those harsh climates and returning to the tropics. And so migration would have originally evolved in hummingbirds, probably by gradually longer and longer northward journeys by some of these species that have evolved in Central America. So slowly populations were sort of making their way northward, and then as they got into more seasonal environments, then they would have been pushed back south to Central America for the winter. So there are a couple really cool aspects of hummingbird migration. One is that they store a tremendous amount of fat. So they will drink a lot of nectar. You might notice, like, if you have hummingbird feeders out in September, that a lot of these hummingbirds that have bred here and are preparing to return to Central America for the winter will be consuming enormous amounts of nectar, and they'll be putting on a lot of fat, and they can actually withstand levels of, like, fat on their arteries that would be deadly to a human being. So they're adapted to be able to put on fat very, very quickly and then burn it off very, very quickly on their migratory journey. And hummingbirds have a really fast metabolism, so that fat will disappear very quickly. Here's a kind of a chunky ruby-throated hummingbird, probably right before migration. And then some species are crossing the Gulf of Mexico. So in the case of ruby-throated hummingbirds in the east, and then sometimes rufous hummingbirds as well, they're making like this roughly 500-mile journey across the Gulf of Mexico. In the spring, they're coming roughly, usually from like the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, all the way across to the southern Louisiana coast of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi. And they will often return to the exact same places every year. So this is something that ecologists call breeding site fidelity, or faithfulness to a breeding location. And I was talking with someone earlier who was telling me about how she had hummingbird coming back to the exact same nest here in her backyard every single year. So they will return to the exact same backyards, the same feeders, the same nesting sites year after year.
Is that flight across the Gulf, what you said it's 500 miles,
Yeah.
is that non-stop with no rest?
It is, yeah,
And
for the most part.
how many days does that take? Constant flying.
That's a good question. It usually, I think it normally doesn't take more than 3 days. Yeah. Yeah. So in some cases, So mortality rate is really high. A lot of these birds don't make that crossing. Actually, you can go on YouTube and look up. So now that there are oil rigs in the Gulf, there are hummingbirds stopping over to rest on those oil rigs. And some of the employees are putting out hummingbird feeders. In some cases, like holding these handheld feeders, because these hummingbirds are so hungry, they will just come right up to them and they'll swarm these oil rigs. So that's a very arduous journey that has a high mortality rate, which makes it even more amazing that like this behavior would have ever evolved in the first place.
And are you saying they'll reuse a nest or just that area?
I think in many cases they reuse the same nests over and over again. They might touch them up or put new material, because mostly they're making nests of moss and lichen and things, and they're weaving that together with spider web. And they're just sticking it onto a branch. They're not like using their nests like a lot of bird species do. And this is easiest to see in the winter. So like you might get lucky enough to go walking in the bosque in the winter, you'll see, if you look really closely, you might see a hummingbird nest in a cottonwood or something. And oftentimes they're just stuck to the branch and they're really secure too. So they can return to the same places year after year. And this is probably a combination of a couple different internal navigational abilities. So one is, we think of like all bird migration navigation as having like a map and a compass component. So one is just knowing which direction to fly in, that's your compass. And then knowing where you are on the landscape is your map. So there's evidence now that birds can have some sort of internal global positioning system based on the Earth's magnetic field, so they can detect the Earth's magnetic field and changes within it across geographic space and know exactly where they are. They can use the stars to orient, so they can know which direction is north, for example, by looking at the North Star and the geometric relationship of all the other constellations around the North Star. And they can use that to maintain course. What's probably going on with sight fidelity in hummingbirds is you have these young hummingbirds that are initially choosing a place by just using that map and compass navigational ability. And then once they find that breeding site, returning to that same site year after year is mostly due to really good spatial memory. So the ability to remember fine details of the landscape, rivers and forests and changes in geography. And so being able to navigate the exact same space year after year. And it's advantageous because you are familiar with that area, you know often where the resources are, you know where the predators are, and so you know kind of generally you might be more successful in raising your offspring in a later year if you return to the exact same place. So this is a map. These are really cool maps from eBird data. So this is observational data that people have submitted to the online database eBird. And these are animations. So we're going to start in January. We're going to go all the way to the end of December. And the darker areas are higher densities of hummingbirds. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird, which we don't have here, but I want to show you this to show you this Gulf crossing. So you'll see right now in January, they're wintering all over Mexico and other Central American, or some Central American countries here. And then a lot of them will jump off from the Yucatan Peninsula right here and go across the Gulf of Mexico. I'll run that. And then they go back. So if I pause, so this is April, oops. So late March, there's just a few starting to show up in the southeast. And you notice that the highest density in Mexico has moved to the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula because that's that shortest distance across the Gulf is roughly from Louisiana or Mississippi to the Yucatan Peninsula.
And so that species completely leaves Mexico?
It does, yeah, for the winter. Yep. So again, this is what I was talking about with avoiding competition. So when it comes time to breed and you need more resources and spaces to nest, you just get all the way out of that area and then you find a place where there's no hummingbirds. In the case of ruby-throateds, they're the only species there in the summer. You have all of those resources to yourself so you can be really successful in breeding, and then you return to that area to escape the harsher climate. And another thing that, so when I worked at a Wild Birds Unlimited in Athens for about 5 years, and every summer I would get this question, the same question from customers, which was, why am I not seeing as many hummingbirds this year as last year? And it took me a while to figure this out, but I think what was often happening is that people were asking this question like May or June, and they were remembering how many hummingbirds they had in like August or September of the previous year. And what's going on there is two things. One, you have juveniles that are hatched and fledged, and so there's more hummingbirds on the landscape. But also you have hummingbirds that are visiting feeders a lot more frequently in the later summer months than they are earlier, because females are busy with breeding, they're consuming lots of insects for their young, so they have a more protein-rich diet than nectar-rich. And then often males are very, very territorial early in the summer, so they're very defensive of the feeders, and so there's just fewer hummingbirds coming to your feeders. And this is cool because this is observational data, and that pattern, that exact pattern is reflected in this data. So if I start like here in late June, you'll notice that it's kind of orangish, there's not much purple, but now in late July, there's already seemingly much higher densities of hummingbirds. And that pattern increases. And so there's more juveniles and people are seeing hummingbirds more. So this is based on observational data. So it has those observational biases in the data. I'll show you a few more maps, but first I want to talk about what hummingbirds we have here in Mexico. So we have two main species breeding here, which are black-chinned, broad-tailed, and then I think I had calliope under breeding, but calliope and rufous should just be migrants for the most part. I think calliope come back through as early as like July, because some of them breed pretty far north and it's already getting cooler up there, so they're coming back through when resource abundance is really high. And then they're arriving in mid to late April, so right now I've started hearing broad-tailed hummingbirds in the foothills, and then I had a couple black-chinned hummingbirds down in the Tingley Beach in the trails near there yesterday. And so migration is rufous and calliope. They're going out to the Pacific Northwest and farther up in the Rockies to breed. And then we have broad-tailed and black-chinned that are spending the summer with us here, and they actually have some really cool ways of avoiding competition with each other during the summer that I'm going to talk about shortly. And hummingbirds in general are very territorial. So we'll try to talk a little bit at the end about how you can reduce the amount of territoriality at your hummingbird feeders if you have that issue and you want to hopefully have more friendly groups of hummingbirds feeding together. All right, so this is the same map. Black-chinned hummingbirds are in Mexico in the winter. And then they go back. So this also, it looks like their population size is really low. Excuse me, I think it's mostly just because of there's low coverage of eBird observations in many parts of Mexico. And so it looks like their range is a lot smaller. And actually you'll notice, like, I think very few people bird in like this part of Mexico, for example, because if I play this animation, it seems like this sort of jump happens and all of a sudden they're in the west. So they breed in New Mexico in really high densities, and you'll notice they're very scattered. Part of that is probably eBird coverage or data coverage, but a lot of it has to do with the sorts of elevations that these hummingbirds are breeding at. So they're avoiding actually high elevation regions for the most part. And you'll see with the other breeding hummingbird species, the rufous, or sorry, let's look at rufous first.
Excuse me, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
You said that just now they were avoiding the high elevations, when previously you mentioned there was a breed in Central America that was surrounding the Andes that could go as high as 16,000 feet.
Yeah, so just
can you
specifically.
differentiate between those two comments?
Yeah, sure. So here I was just referring specifically to black-chinned hummingbirds avoiding high elevations. So there's some species are really well adapted for high elevation living, and others are not so much, and we'll talk about that in physiology.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. So this is, rufous hummingbirds do what's called circular migration, where they kind of have this elliptical migration, where they kind of have an elliptical pattern to their migratory routes. So they're virtually not found in New Mexico on spring migration, but they're here in the fall. So in spring, probably for climatic reasons or resource abundance, what types of plants are flowering at this time, they're following the west coast mostly, up into the Pacific Northwest to breed, and then they're taking a more easterly interior route on the way back in the fall. And this is just an example of following resources and co-evolving to take advantage of resources in different areas at different times, which is one of the really cool aspects of bird migration. And this is the broadtail. So this is another breeding species in New Mexico. So these are kind of showing the opposite or complementary pattern to black-chinned hummingbirds, where they're occupying the higher elevations, and black-chins are avoiding the higher elevations. And we are going to get there, but first we need to preface that by talking about hummingbird flight. So hummingbirds can beat their wings up to like 60 times per second. I think that's the case of the ruby-throated hummingbird, and there's some variation around that. So they're incredibly fast. This process of beating their wings that fast requires more oxygen input per second than any other process in the animal kingdom. So it's the most expensive from an oxygen perspective. It's also very expensive from a metabolic perspective. They need lots of calories throughout the day to be able to maintain these high energy levels. And you've probably noticed, like, hummingbirds barely ever sit still. Like, they will sit and they're fidgeting the whole time. So they're very, very hyperactive. And thanks to this like really unique flight style, they can hover and fly backward, and they can fly forward very, very fast. And the way that they do this is basically like, I have a diagram of it somewhere here. This is basically like a helicopter. So when they hover, their wings beat very differently from other birds. So their wings beat in like a flat figure-8 pattern, and this allows them to hover in one spot. And so as long as their wings are beating fast enough to overcome the force of gravity, they'll stay in that spot, or they can even fly vertically. And the same thing with a helicopter. And all they have to do is, just like a helicopter, tilt the angle of their wings, and suddenly they can fly backwards. So when you see them coming up to a flower and hovering and flying backward, they're basically just tilting their body slightly, and their flight is the exact same, and then they're flying backward. And then they're reversing the pattern of their wing beats too. And so when they fly forward, now they're flying in much more vertical strokes. And we'll watch, hopefully this video will play. But they can fly forward like 25 miles an hour just by tilting their bodies forward and making their wing beats a little more vertical. I do not know if this will play. Doesn't look like it's going to play. I'll try it at the end. And then another aspect of hummingbird physiology is torpor. So torpor is kind of a semi-hibernation. It is a way of handling really, really cold temperatures, especially for species that have really fast metabolisms. And like if they were to sleep for 8 hours and not undergo torpor, they would just run out of calories and like die in their sleep. And so torpor allows hummingbirds to actually lower their body temperature significantly, like 20 to 30 degrees while they sleep. And then they expend much less calories. Their heart rate drops, I think in some cases by as much as like 50%. And so they can spend the night in really, really cold environments just by undergoing this torpor. And their feet actually, when they're sleeping, they lock onto a branch while they're sleeping. And so they go into torpor, lock onto the branch, and actually have been found hummingbirds like hanging upside down on the branch because their feet slipped, but they're still locked onto the branch, and they're fine. They're just sleeping like that. So, all right, so I've said several times that hummingbirds can live at extremely high elevations where you or I would start to get elevation sickness, or maybe it would have trouble even acclimatizing to over a longer period of time. Hummingbirds, the most extreme example of this is living at 16,000 feet in the Andes, but even the fact that like broadtails are breeding up close to the Sandia crest is still an example of pretty impressive physiological adaptations to be able to handle those lower oxygen environments. So we know this is a tough environment for any organism, but especially for hummingbirds, because like I said, they need so much oxygen per second to be able to function and fly. So there's a couple different ways they can do this. Some are more general to birds. So for example, birds have unidirectional airflow. So we have bidirectional airflow where we breathe in to our lungs and then breathe out. And that means that there's always some waste air in our lungs. There's always some CO2 that isn't being used, or sorry, some oxygen that isn't being used and some CO2 that's taking up that capacity in our lungs. Hummingbirds have unidirectional airflow, and other birds do too, where they have lungs, but the air comes in the lungs, there's some oxygen exchange that happens there, and then it actually cycles through the entire bird through 9 different air sacs. And these are basically just like these thin, kind of stretchy membranes that are in various parts of the bird's body. Some of them are close to the pectoral muscles, which is the flight muscles, and they allow for oxygen to go directly to those muscles rather than having to have the bloodstream carry it around the body. Oxygen takes it directly to those really important muscles. And so like if you dissect a bird, you'll see these little membranes around the muscle tissue. So hummingbirds have that, so oxygen goes in, cycles through the body, and it goes back out the lungs, and by that time it's just CO2. So all the oxygen exchange has happened, the CO2 leaves the body, and so it makes this loop through the body instead of just going in and back out like it does for us. Hummingbirds have particularly efficient hemoglobin. All birds have really efficient hemoglobin, which is the molecule that binds to oxygen and carries it throughout the body. So hummingbirds have this, or high elevation hummingbirds have this really efficient hemoglobin that is a little more expensive to produce, but the benefit of having that outweighs the cost of producing it. And so hummingbirds have evolved this, and this just allows for much more efficient oxygen transfer around the body to be able to maintain high-speed flight at those elevations. Also, hummingbirds have, actually all birds have this too. In our lungs we have air flowing one direction and blood flowing the same direction. And that means that our ability to like pick up oxygen from the air for our blood, the capillaries to be able to pick it up, is a little bit less than if it would flow perpendicular, which is what birds have. So the air comes in their lungs, it flows perpendicular to the flow of blood, and so blood actually picks up a lot more oxygen from that air. And they have, some species have really large hearts as well. So what this means for hummingbird ecology, or the interaction of our 2 breeding species here in New Mexico, the black-chinned hummingbird and the broad-tailed, is that they're actually able to partition themselves across the landscape when they're breeding. So right now you might see broad-taileds in the valley along with black-chinned, but come June they'll be basically separate in space. You might hear broad-tailed in the foothills and higher up, and then you'll hear and see black-chinned hummingbirds here in the valley. And my advisor at UNM did some experiments on these 2 species to see if there were physiological differences in these 2 species that allowed them to sort of partition the landscape in that way. An extreme example of this is like if you go up to high elevations in like Estes Park, Colorado or something, or Rocky Mountain National Park, you'll see lots of broad-tailed hummingbirds and no black-chinned. And what they've determined is that black-chinned are so they're the larger species. They are competitively dominant in the valley, so they can outmuscle the broad-tailed hummingbirds. But broad-tailed hummingbirds have more efficient adaptations for high elevation living, and so they can go higher in elevation before their bodies reach hypoxia, which is low oxygen, or oxygen too low to function. Whereas black-chinned can't go as high, and so black-chinned outcompete broad-taileds at low elevations, but broad-tailed hummingbirds, despite being smaller, outcompete black-chinned at high elevations thanks to these nice adaptations. I'm going to try and, I don't think it's going to do that. I don't have Wi-Fi. Another aspect of hummingbird physiology is this phenomenon of structural coloring. So we think of a lot of bird color as being due to pigments, and you have different classes of pigments. You have carotenoids, you have porphyrins, you have melanins. So carotenoids make summer tanagers and western tanagers red or yellow. Porphyrins make, I'm trying to think of an example of a green bird around here. They make, well, melanins make dark-edged juncos gray, crows black. And then porphyrins make birds green in general, and some variations on those colors. And then you have birds that are blue, and actually there's no birds that are truly blue. At least there's no blue pigment in bird feathers. It's all structural coloring. So pigment has to do with how light interacts with the molecule at the molecular level. And then structural coloring has to do with how light interacts with the feather, it's still at the microscopic scale, but it's actually the structure of the feather that produces the color. So this is true of all blue birds. It's true of iridescent birds. So if you've ever looked at like the throat of a broad-tailed hummingbird and noticed how, whether, depending on the angle that the sun is hitting the throat of the bird at or the angle that you're viewing the bird at, the color might change a little bit from like a deeper, more crimson red to a lighter kind of metallic red. And the reason for that is that you have white light with all of the different wavelengths hitting the throats of these hummingbirds. Or in the case of the back of the hummingbird, like a greenish back that changes with the angle. So this light's coming in, and then it's a lot of those wavelengths are being absorbed into this melanin layer, this layer that's so melanin again is responsible for dark color, so a lot of that light gets absorbed. And then several of those wavelengths get scattered back out. And so for the throat of a broad-tailed hummingbird, just the color red gets scattered back out, and it gets distributed into like different wavelengths. So you have different shades of red that get reflected and refracted at different angles, and so the angle that you view the bird at leads it to look slightly different. It's true of like lazuli buntings, western bluebirds, indigo buntings. You ever watch them change from like a sky blue to like a deeper indigo blue? It's the exact same phenomenon happening. It's also advantageous for birds because this sort of structural coloring is a lot more durable. It doesn't wear as quickly as pigment coloring does. And at some point, I think like Toyota was considering using structural coloring in car paint because it doesn't fade as fast as pigment coloring. Finally, I want to talk about hummingbirds and climate change. So the climate is warming. We are getting slowly, or fairly rapidly at this point, but higher average winter temperatures and summer temperatures. And again, hummingbirds are sensitive to these climatic extremes. And one really interesting thing that's been happening is with, for example, the rufous hummingbird. So this is the normal range of rufous hummingbirds. This is a eBird map of all the observations of rufous hummingbirds. And you'll notice that all this purple, there's a lot more purple in the east. There's supposedly no rufous hummingbirds in the east. So what's going on there? Well, rufous hummingbirds have historically only lived in western North America. But in recent years, they are becoming more and more common in the eastern half of the continent. So and they're actually showing up mostly in the winter. So they're not showing up in the breeding season, they're showing up in the winter, and they're staying year round. And in fact, a few years ago in Athens, Georgia, we had a calliope, a rufous hummingbird, and a black-chinned hummingbird all in town at different people's feeders at the same time. So all these different western hummingbirds that were spending the winter and nights that were getting down into the teens sometimes, but were surviving thanks to torpor and thanks to people putting out these feeders. So nobody's proven this. My guess is what's happening is that you have, again, this navigational system that birds have that's genetically programmed, the ability to know where to fly and when to fly. And there's going to be some genetic variation. That means some birds' compasses are slightly off. And so in the past, if a bird had a compass that pointed, instead of south for migration, it was pointing more east, those rufous hummingbirds would have ended up in the east, and most of them would have died during the winter due to a lack of food resources. But now we've got these birds that are surviving the winter as far north as Pennsylvania or New York, where it's getting down in single digits frequently at night. And they're able to survive this probably because people are putting out more artificial food, and then maybe the slow trend of warming average winter temperatures as well. My guess is what's happening is these two things are causing birds that have this compass that's slightly off to now be able to survive and pass on those genes and pass on that same genetic programming. And so this is slowly becoming more and more common as their offspring follow the same migratory routes.
So do we need to keep our feeders out throughout the winter now?
So you don't need to, and it's happening less in New Mexico, though. What is happening here is that birds that breed here, like black-chinned hummingbirds, often are in some cases, spending the winter. So people will do it because it's fun to get a rare hummingbird to your feeder in the winter in the east. But you just want to be sure that you're committed to keeping that feeder out throughout the winter. I think it's less of an issue here. I think they would probably find something to live off of, even if there were no feeders available. But if you were living farther north, then you definitely want to make sure you can keep the feeder out and keep the feeder filled for the winter. And then attracting hummingbirds. So more practically for a second about attracting hummingbirds. How many of you, just a quick show of hands, have hummingbird feeders in your yard? So how many of you have, yeah?
Okay, if you have another feeder for other birds, like I have mourning doves, and then I have the feeder over, will those mourning doves scare any of the hummingbirds from coming to the hummingbird feeder that's down from it?
Yep. For the most part, at least in my experience, they don't. So hummingbirds are really, despite being small, they're really aggressive. And I've seen them chase bigger birds away from their own feeders. Sometimes you get woodpeckers coming to drink nectar from feeders, and they'll scare those away sometimes. So they're very aggressive, and it shouldn't be an issue.
Well, I've only seen one hummingbird, just one.
Just this season, or just in general?
Well, this month, I've
Okay,
only
yeah.
seen one.
Yeah, and that's pretty expected. The first few are coming through now, but you might see them less on migration than you will in winter. It just depends. In summer, it just depends. Yeah.
Okay.
Good question.
They're afraid of bees, though. Right?
Yeah, so that's another thing we'll talk about. So, nothing here. So these are my personal favorite style of feeder. They're dishwasher safe. You can put them through the top rack of the dishwasher. And one of the big things with hummingbird feeders is just cleaning them, because there's lots of nooks and crannies that can get moldy, and it can be really tough to clean. So it's really nice that these can be put in the dishwasher. For bee protection against bees and yellow jackets and things, you can put these little protective covers on, and they basically just go on the bottom of the feeder right here. And they're like little plastic or rubber tips that have little slits in them, so hummingbirds can pierce that with their beak and drink the nectar, but it keeps bees from getting into the nectar. And these also they don't leak because just the way that they're designed, the sugar water just sits in the bottom. Sometimes you get leakage with more bottle-shaped feeders, which are fine as well. I tend to prefer this style, but you can certainly do a variety of feeders. And then to avoid territoriality, so really the best thing, there's not a whole lot you can do, but the best thing you can do is put up multiple feeders and to spread those out in space. So if you have a feeder that is 10 feet away from the other feeder, in some cases that can help, because it just means that territorial bird has to spend more energy defending both feeders, and sometimes I guess we'll decide that's not worth it. Or you can put them around the corner of the house or around the other side of a tree, somewhere that's out of sight of the other feeder. And growing up, I did this experiment in my parents' yard, and that was the only way that I found to allow more than one hummingbird at a time, was to put one feeder out of sight of the other. Yeah.
Sometimes I've noticed if you have a lot of hummingbirds, after a certain number, they just all will freely feed right next to each other. I'm wondering what that number is.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought about that as well, because there's some threshold, right, where it becomes too energy expensive to try and chase everybody away. So what I found, working at Wild Birds Unlimited, was that people that had lots of hummingbirds, ant moats on the feeder, which are these little cups that hold water. So you just fill this with water, and it keeps the ants from climbing down. Keeps ants from climbing down and getting to your sugar water, because this is their only access point. That can help a lot as well. In general, you want to change your sugar water probably in this climate. I would guess about 4 days. Maybe the folks here have like a specific recommendation. In Georgia, it was like 3 days was the max because it was so humid and a lot of bacteria would begin to grow. But the issue is just that because it's sugar water, bacteria does grow very, very quickly, and that can make birds sick. So you want to make sure that as soon as the sugar water starts to get cloudy, you take it down, ideally before. And you can put, do you all sell Feeder Fresh or Nectar Defender?
We do. There should be some on the table right there in front of you.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Yes, thank you. So this is Nectar Defender. You can add, it's a certain amount, I think it's like a tablespoon per quart of nectar. And this is a natural micronutrient, the natural preservative that is found in flowers in the wild. And this is a concentrate that you put in the nectar, and it can help it last, in my experience, up to like 7 or more days, 7 to 10 days. It probably differs in a drier climate, maybe lasts even a little longer. But this is a great resource that just helps you not have to make sugar water so often. You can certainly make it in batches and keep it in your fridge as well. And there are various, so there's a couple different hummingbird mixtures. Many of these you just mix directly with water and stir them up. You don't have to heat them. And then you can make your own nectar as well. It's roughly 1 part sugar to 4 parts water. And then you bring that to a boil for about a minute and then let it cool.
Why do you boil it?
What's that?
Why do you boil it?
Well, it just helps the sugar to dissolve into the water. That's it. Just
Oh,
helps
okay,
to
yeah, I know, it
homogenize
does
that.
help it mix better for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Just
So I
makes
thought
it-
maybe we get rid of some kind of bacteria in water that we drink, or?
No, it should be, as long as you're using pure refined sugar and not like brown sugar or something else that would have a lot of impurities in it. Just pure refined sugar with water is what's going to most closely mimic their natural sugar water. Yeah.
I had a question about insect eating in hummingbirds.
Yeah.
Has there been any study of either here with our hummingbirds or in general about how much of their diet could consist of insects
Yeah.
compared to nectar?
That's a great question. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I would guess that there is a number out there.
It's fascinating because underneath one of our porches in particular, it's shaded, and you can sit there and look up and wonder what the bird's doing because the feeder's right there.
Yeah.
And she's going
Right.
around and you can see she's picking up real small gnats, right, might be flying around, so.
Yes, yeah, great question. And they certainly, this is true of all birds that are either nectarivores or frugivores. They're supplementing their diet a lot with insects and protein. But I don't know what the exact ratio would be. If I had to guess, it'd be like 20% of their diet, and like by weight would be insects. One really cool thing you'll see sometimes is so after sapsuckers, like we have red-naped sapsuckers here that will drill sap wells in trees and let the sap drain out, and hummingbirds will actually, so insects are attracted to those, and hummingbirds will come and eat the insects that are attracted to them.
So did you use distilled water?
I would say yes, in general. That's probably a good idea. Yeah.
Okay,
better
because
than
I have a picture that takes out lead and what have you
Yeah.
out of the water, and that's what I've been using.
Yeah,
instead
that's-
of the distilled water.
That should be,
Okay.
I mean, I think anything that just filters, any kind of water filter, I don't think it has to be like really, really pure water. I mean, whatever is mixed with nectar in the wild is going to have some impurities in it as well. So that pitcher water should be fine with just a basic filter. Sorry, one.
Sorry. I have a family of hawks
Uh-huh.
right behind me, and my hummingbirds have decreased the last couple of years since the hawks moved in. Is
Mhm.
that the reason why, or am I just blaming it on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would doubt it just because most, are they Cooper's hawks?
Yeah.
Okay. They're mostly going after larger prey because hummingbirds are just really hard to catch for a bigger bird like that.
Yeah.
But I think it could be changes in the landscape. It could be like changes in habitat nearby, or the abundance of flowers, or even like how many feeders your neighbors have out, or things like that can cause pretty big changes in hummingbird densities. That's a good question. Yeah, actually, one of the big predators is praying mantises. And they will sit on hummingbird feeders, and they will reach out and grab hummingbirds. So just, you can remove those if you see them on your feeder. Yeah.
I had a question about them. When the young fledge,
Mhm.
they've never been to Mexico.
Mhm.
They don't fly in flocks, right, do they? I mean, how do
They
they
don't,
find their way
yeah.
back, and how do they get enough food since they've never actually fed on their own. Obviously they do it, but how do they know where Mexico is?
Right, yeah, that's a good question. So this is actually, I'm giving a migration presentation for the Santa Fe store in May, and this is one of the main topics that I cover. So I'll give you a brief answer now, and then hopefully at some point you can come to a talk on that, because it's really, really fascinating. And there's been, since the 70s, studies on trying to figure out like how birds know like what direction to go in, and then how they know when they've arrived.
These are birds who have never done it, I get.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it is partly a genetic program. They have an ability to sense where magnetic north is, and they can tell which direction to face in based on changes in light. So in the spring, as the days get longer, they know to face north. In the fall, as the days get shorter, they know to face south, and they know which directions those are because of their magnetic sense, and probably because of stars. So a lot of birds, including hummingbirds, migrate at night, and so they're using constellations to navigate, in many cases, the North Star. And this has been shown in studies by a professor at Cornell in the 70s, Stephen T. Emlyn, who basically took indigo buntings, which are a songbird that breeds in North America and winters in Central America. And he put them in cages. He put ink on their feet, and he put paper down in the base of the cage, and he simulated both the changes in day length and the night sky as it would be in the fall or in the spring. And he found that they were able to respond to those changes, and he looked at the average direction that their footprints faced in, and found that as days got shorter, and he arranged the sky such that it would look like it would in the fall, they faced south, and then north in the spring. So they're using, and then the question is, like, they know which direction to fly in, but how do they know when they've arrived? And like you said, they've never seen Mexico. And that, they think now, has largely to do with like an internal global positioning system or internal map sense based on the Earth's magnetic field. So birds have these molecules in their brains called cryptochrome, and these molecules have these entangled pairs of electrons. So there's this phenomenon called quantum entanglement, basically where Einstein called it like spooky action at a distance, where you have two electrons that can like seem to communicate with each other instantaneously at a big distance, and they actually create a small magnetic field. So blue light comes into birds' eyes. It actually excites these entangled pairs of electrons in this molecule called cryptochrome, and it creates these small but very sensitive magnetic fields in the bird's brain. And birds actually use that magnetic field to detect the Earth's magnetic field, which varies both latitudinally and longitudinally. And so they can actually know generally where they are on Earth's surface. And they've done experiments with common reed warblers. And they like captured them in a town in Russia, and they took them to a nearby town, and they did some experiments to determine that birds could tell not only which direction to face on migration, but how to get back to their original route, which meant they knew where they were on the Earth's surface. So it's really fascinating stuff. Yeah.
So, why do they migrate alone, and do the parents teach the babies survival skills?
Yeah. So for hummingbirds, there is some parental care after the nesting phase. So the juveniles will follow the adults around to some degree for a period. And then when it comes time to migrate, it's a good question about like why they don't migrate in groups. There are species out there like sandhill cranes, for example, that do learned migration, where the young follow the adults to migrate for that first year. But in many species of songbirds, and like hummingbirds, for example, as well, that behavior, they've evolved to migrate separately. It could have something to do with like how they get resources. So if you're migrating in big groups, it could be more competition with other members of your group to find resources and refuel along the way. And I guess it's maybe misleading to say they don't migrate in groups. They do migrate in, like you will see waves of hummingbirds turning up, or like in the Gulf of Mexico on those oil rigs, often it's groups of hummingbirds, just by nature of the fact that when it's good to migrate, it's good for everybody to migrate. And so they're not intentionally migrating those family groups, but and a lot of that is just because like many hummingbird and songbird and other families of birds, there's not really strong family ties. So as soon as they've raised young, it becomes advantageous from an evolutionary perspective for the parents to take care of themselves and for the young to go off and take care of themselves as well. It's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, are there any states where hummingbirds have not been identified, like Hawaii or Alaska?
Where they haven't been seen at all?
Yes.
That's a great question. I think that there are rufous hummingbirds that have turned up as far north as Alaska. I don't know about Hawaii though. There might be some vagrant hummingbirds that have made their way over to Hawaii. I wouldn't be too surprised. Like again, their compass can be totally off and they end up in really weird places, but good question.
I just came back from Hawaii. They don't have many, but in the last several years, they're getting more and more and more. And people are more aware over there too, so they start putting the feeders out. So you see them, but you have to really look for them too.
Interesting.
Well, you mentioned the tropical climate. They live in the
Yep.
tropics. I mean, honestly, I would think Hawaii would be like their paradise.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it could be a more, like what I was talking about with birds migrating east, it could be that they're establishing a migratory route there. Some of this is also just the fact that every year there's more people bird watching, more people looking for birds, so there's that bias of just how many people are out there. I saw a hand somewhere.
I thought hummingbirds were only found in the Americas and the tropics, but you mentioned Africa, so are they found in Asia, Africa, and Europe?
So what I was showing you there were sunbirds, which are a different family or a different order of birds. Yeah, so these are, they're what scientists refer to as analogs, or species that are very similar in many ways, but are unrelated. So at one point they would have, or the ancestors of hummingbirds would have been on those continents, but they're not today. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering about the terrible wind we've
Yeah.
been experiencing.
Sure.
And what do the hummingbirds do, and really all of them?
Yeah.
I worry about them, and are they locked on big time? Or what are they
Yeah.
doing when that wind is roaring?
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that they're finding like dense juniper or places like that to roost in, that it's as sheltered from the wind as possible. And for us, at our like with our size, it's hard to find spaces like that that are really sheltered from the wind. But for smaller birds, they can go far enough in dense vegetation that they're probably mostly protected from that wind. But you're right that they do latch on, like many birds, when they sleep and roost at night, they're latching onto the branch. Yeah.
I want to just make a comment. We have a black chin that's has bred had nested on our porch in a very obscure location. This would be the 4th year, but makes it back this year. And the first year was a single clutch. The second year, double clutch. But on the second batch of babies, using the same nest that it used from the previous year, the third clutch in. And that even though she had tried to kind of fix it up for that last clutch, it's so stretched out that the babies fell out about a week short of fledging and died on the table. And as a result, the next year, I took the nest away so that it forced her to make a new nest, and probably because she spent so much energy on that, she was double clutch.
Yeah.
But she was successful. So I just caution people about leaving a nest up for future use, because if it's right there at the start of the season, you may end up with the same double clutch issue that we faced, and it was very sad to see.
Yeah.
I was thinking, you just thought, can you just make it one more week, but they didn't. So.
Yeah, and it could have been like an inexperienced bird. Like a lot of times they're seem to be adjusting their exact timing of their reproduction based on life experience.
Yeah.
And especially for species that do double broods. Trying to match the timing correctly so that it's not too late, not too early is tough. Yeah.
Do they commonly have two?
I think in these, like in this region, so the black chin have two typically. I'm not sure about broad-tailed. It can vary within species too, depending on where they are. So if they're lower latitudes where the growing season or like warm season is longer, they can have more clutches, and sometimes the same individuals will have just one clutch farther north. Yeah.
Who are their predators?
So, praying mantises, yeah. Roadrunners, yes. Really?
They will come in our backyard and actually sit on the post by the feeder and grab them.
Wow. So that's new to me. Thanks for sharing that. So yeah, roadrunners, cats. Yeah, so feral cats. So keep your cat indoors. And then I think snakes are nest predators of hummingbirds. Like smaller arboreal snakes can be nest predators of hummingbirds as well. And that's really like for a lot of predation. That has a bigger impact on populations than like just a single adults getting eaten. That is a problem too, or can be a limiting factor for populations. Not necessarily a problem, but it's typically you think of population growth rate as like birth minus deaths at the most basic level. And so you can increase the number of deaths or you can decrease the number of births if you want that population rate to slow down or go negative even. And it's often that decreasing the number of births that has the biggest impact on question.
What's the lifespan of the hummingbirds that we get that come here?
That's a really good question. I think it's, for most of them, it's about 4 years, but that it's a little more nuanced because after the first year, if you make it through the first year, your life expectancy goes up considerably because most mortality happens in that first year. And so if your overall average might be that, like your life expectancy at birth is different from your life expectancy in like the second year of life. It should be around 4 to 5 years. Yeah.
A more practical question is, where you're hanging your feeder, does it make a difference if it's in shade, if it's in sun, if it's up high, down low, that kind of thing?
So it really doesn't. I would put it high, I would put it at least like 5 feet off the ground, ideally because of feral cats or outdoor cats. That will limit their ability to catch hummingbirds. And then otherwise, it's really just like wherever is the best viewing opportunity for you because hummingbirds are really tame. You can put them close to your window. I don't know if they have them here, but there's also like suction cup hummingbird feeders you put on your window. And so, it's really mostly about where you can view them the best. And in general, native plants are better for as good for attracting hummingbirds as feeders. If you can do a combination of native plants and hummingbird feeders, you'll get a lot more hummingbirds and you'll probably have less territoriality because now you're increasing the space and the amount of resources that a single hummingbird has to guard. So another hand somewhere.
Right here.
Yeah.
How about the tongue? Is it split or is it a tube? And where does it rest in the throat or up in the skull?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about, so I know for woodpeckers it wraps around the skull, but I think for hummingbirds it rests in the bottom of the throat. Fairly certain of that. And then it does split at the end, and it's structured in such a way that like they can sort of lap up nectar, and like small amounts of nectar will sit on the tongue as they retract. Yeah, of course. Thank you for coming. Thank you. Yeah.
I have a glass feeder. Does it matter on how it's drawn? Because I don't have one of those. Like I said, it's glass and it has the bottom like that one.
Yep.
Does it matter
Whether it's glass or not? No.
The feeder, the liquid that it's in is glass, and then that rotation is that split is at the bottom. So does it matter?
Are you talking about the material specifically?
No, just the type of feeder it is.
It really doesn't. So type of feeder or shape structure really doesn't matter that much for the birds themselves. Like as long as it has some red on it.
It does. It has the same type of the one that you were showing in the lights. It has that same kind of bottom.
Cool. Yeah, that should be totally fine then.
Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Yeah. Other questions? These are great. Yeah, of course. I'll be around a little bit afterward. There's some books on hummingbirds up here, some field guides to hummingbirds. I also have some business cards here, so I lead birding trips and do sort of like backyard or property consulting. So you can check out my website. You can take a business card if you'd like. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thanks a lot.